Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to this month's History Bites session. My name is Emma Tenier-Stewart, and I am a Visitor Experience Assistant here at Guelph Museums. So History Bites is a monthly casual lunchtime conversation and talk series. We talk about kind of the latest history news, our collections, and what we have going on in our exhibits. So today's talk is going to be one of our kind of sub-series called Live from the Vaults. So you can see behind me, I'm in the archives at Guelph Museums. We're going to mostly be talking about some of the materials in our archives, doing sort of a little show and tell with those. During this, feel free to ask questions in the comment section of the Facebook feed where you might be watching. We're going to do our best to answer some of them at the end of the program if we get any questions. And you're likely watching through Facebook or on our website right now, but it's also going to be available to watch afterwards, both through our Facebook site and through our website. So definitely feel free to do that then. If you have any questions after the fact as well, don't forget to reach out to us. We're happy to try and answer those for you. So just before we start, I'm going to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. So whenever we gather in person or online here at Guelph Museums, we first focus our thoughts within an awareness and acknowledgement of the land. Guelph is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Through the Between the Lakes Purchase No. 3 Treaty of 1792, the Mississaugas of the Credit ceded to the British Crown over 3 million acres of land between Lakes Huron, Ontario, and Erie. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Guelph Museums commits to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and we must do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. So to start today's presentation, I decided that when I went into the vaults and figured out what we were going to be talking about today, I wanted to take the History Bites lunchtime theme a little literally. We'll be talking about the cookbooks we have in our collection, along with a few of the kind of cooking utensils and other cooking related items that we have. Personally, I have always loved food history. It's actually how I got my start in the museum world. I started as a kid volunteering at a historic house museum, creating old recipes, helping school groups do that. And I've always found it to be a really fantastic, really tangible way of connecting with history. There's a phrase often used by historians that the past is a foreign country. And I think when we think of looking at other cultures, often if we don't know anything about another culture, we might know a little bit about its food. It's a really accessible way of engaging with another culture, of learning a little bit about that daily reality. So if we apply that same thing, if we think of history as something that can be hard to find accessible, can be hard to relate to, but we look at the food that was eaten throughout history, it's just that slightly easier access point to try and learn a little bit about what day-to-day life was like. Today's talk won't be comprehensive. We're just talking about some of the cookbooks that we have in our collection. We have a vast array of them. We couldn't look through all of them, unfortunately. And it's really just what we have in our collection too. So we're just using it to take these little snapshots of Guelph's history. And that's really what food works best for. Food is inherently impermanent unless you're digging up a bottle of olive oil from the Mediterranean that lasts forever. But for the most part, it's always just about moments in history. So this talk, we're just going to look at some of these recipes, some of the people that made these recipes or ate these foods, and use that as an access point to learn maybe just a little bit about what their life and context was like. Now, I've always thought that the best way to engage with food history is to actually make and eat it. It's one thing to read a recipe on the page, but then to actually see what the experience of making it and eating it is like really brings it to life and really gives you that access point for history. So at the end, we have a collection of pictures and a couple of videos of the Guelph Museum's staff's attempts to make some of these old recipes with varying levels of success. And we're also going to post a lot of these recipes online. So the link for that will be in our Facebook comments on this video. And it's also all going to be available just through our website. So we definitely invite you to try those too. Finally, just before we kind of get started into the real content, we posted a picture of this last week and asked you to guess what it was. And we had a whole bunch of different guesses with varying levels of correctness, and we did actually have one person guess accurately. So it's a donut cutter. So it's meant to roll circles out of the dough for a donut, and then you fry them. So that's always been one of my favorite cooking related artifacts in the collection. I think it's absolutely wonderful. So the first kind of theme that I'm going to talk about, we're going to have this kind of in three themes: food during times of hardship, everyday eating, and then kind of our celebratory food, which feels particularly appropriate for this time of year. So I'll be talking about food in times of hardship first, though. And this, I think, is something we can relate to especially easily this year. This year, we're having a much easier time relating to a couple different components of history. We can imagine what life was like during the 1918 flu pandemic. We can imagine what life might have been like under rationing or other strict wartime measures. And I think this year we really have been a lot of food. Food can really come to the fore during times of hardship. So whether it's because of food insecurity or anxieties about access to food, or because, as has often been the case this year, people are turning to food for comfort. So we've seen people talking about making sourdough and growing their own gardens and preserving things, all sorts of things like that. So I think we'll see through this collection some similarities to this year. And in fact, one of the things that was donated to us here at the museum as part of our rapid response collecting initiative was the Little Bites Tastes from Isolation, a community cookbook produced by Guelph-based Taste Detours. And that was made specifically for the pandemic. And I really like thinking that someday down the line, researchers will be looking back at that much the same way we're about to look back on some of the older artifacts from these difficult times that are in our collection. So I'm going to go to a slideshow because we're working with archival materials. Some are quite delicate, and I don't want to it's going to be a bit tricky to hold them up here. So instead, I have some pictures on the slideshow so you can really see what that's going to look like. I'm just going to get this open here, just a second. So the first item that we have, this is part of a whole collection of rationing coupons. So these were issued during World War II, beginning in 1942, and allowed for weekly allotments of various foods, including sugar, coffee, tea, butter, and meat. So these were actual coupons that were given to someone here in Guelph. And so just to get a sense of what the rationing was like, adults were allocated 200 grams of sugar a week, whereas these days the average Canadian eats about 100 grams of sugar a day. Adults were also given 24 tea bags a week and 1 stick of butter. I couldn't find how much coffee, and I know that would be important to know, but I don't have that information, unfortunately. Before 1942, so before rationing came into effect, Canadians were encouraged not to eat foods that Britain relied on us for. So things that we were really trying to ship as much food as possible to Britain and to troops on the front. And then when rationing came into effect, that was to further double down on that effort to really, really ensure that all of the best food made it overseas. Canadians also had our European export market cut off. So things that we were used to sending to Europe to sell, those who grew and produced them here in Canada were suffering a little bit. So Canadians were actually encouraged to eat some of those. And those included apples and actually lobster. So that part of the war eating experience doesn't sound quite so bad. It was actually a really interesting time for food in Canada. So right around, so in the 1940s, right when rationing started, there was actually a huge amount of research being done on nutritional values of various foods. So in order to be able to implement rationing, we had to have a better understanding of how much nutrients the average person needed. So there was all sorts of great research being done there. And then in fact, in part because of rationing, the average Canadian during the war was actually better nourished than they had been before. So not only were they allocated the correct amount of food, but there was a price freeze on food throughout the duration of the war, which meant that by the end of the war especially, they were really able to afford food in a way that they might not have been before. Now, another government initiative was around war bread. So this is a recipe that comes from one of my absolute favorite items in our recipe collection. I'm going to be talking about it a little bit more a little later. But this is tucked into a recipe collection. It's a pamphlet for how to make war breads and substitutes. And what this is referring to is the fact that, like many of our best foods, wheat flour was being shipped to England. So instead, those of us here in Canada were left to fend for ourselves with whole wheat flour, graham flour, oatmeal flour. There was a similar campaign in World War I, actually, and there's a Guelph Mercury article with a recipe for war bread made out of potato flour. So there's all of these kind of substitutes for what we might have preferred to be cooking with. I always find this really interesting. So there's like the whole wheat bread in here, there's rye bread. These are things that are really valued right now, but they would have felt like a bit of a come down during the war. Now, in that same box collection, there is a newspaper clipping, and it has a recipe for no kneading bread rolls. It's very mundane, makes 12 dozen bread rolls, just a kind of workaday recipe. But we know that it comes from the era of World War II. So it doesn't mention war flour specifically, but it does say that you might need to change your method a little bit depending on what kind of flour you use. So they were acknowledging there's different flours out there at the time. But what's especially impactful, I found, with this piece, it's just a small piece of newspaper folded up in this collection. But on the other side from the recipe, there is part of the list of that week's war dead. So this is just a mundane recipe in a mundane recipe collection. And at the same time, this war is going on and people are dying. So yeah, really, this one really illustrated to me the way that food just kind of goes on even in times of hardship. Now we have a few of these Victory Garden certificates. So this is relating to another campaign that was run by the government in part and also by local horticultural societies. So you can see here, this is a certificate rewarding a Guelphite for an outstanding victory garden. And victory gardens, they're something that have been mentioned a little bit today during the pandemic, but they were essentially private gardens meant to grow produce and other foods that there might have been shortages of. So this would alleviate a little bit of the pressure on Canadian agriculture and allow more foods to be sent overseas. Interestingly, at first, when these victory gardens started popping up, the Canadian government was actually opposed to them. There was fear that all of these inexperienced new gardeners would waste much needed seeds because they didn't know the correct techniques for getting kind of a maximum yield. So at first the government tried to shut these down, but as the war wore on and as seed shortages became less of a problem, the government did start encouraging them. And there's an estimate that there were about 209,000 victory gardens in operation across Canada at the peak of the campaign in 1944. We've also got these canning guides here. So these ones that we have in our collection were privately issued, but there were also government issued ones as well. And these were guides on how to take all that lovely produce that you had and preserve it, kind of stretching out those supplies, really make sure you're getting the most out of everything that you can. Alongside the rationing campaign, so you would get your weekly allotment of sugar, but you could also apply for canning sugar coupons that are very, very strict. We have some of them here, and they make it very clear that you are only to use that sugar for canning and not for making other sweets. And I really liked one of these guides. Just has the phrase "in these troubled times," and then goes on to explain why canning is so important. And reading it really reminded me of virtually every guide I've read to how to do anything during this pandemic. There's this sort of quick acknowledgement of, oh, these times are tough, here's what we've got to do. So that felt very, very real to me this year, especially. Finally, we have this letter here, and this was actually a letter that was brought into the museum, written by the person who donated the rationing coupons I showed you earlier. And this was written in 1981, just looking back on the era of rationing that he had these coupons from. And I found it really enjoyable to read. It's a little tongue-in-cheek. He's talking about a difficult time, but with still a little bit of a sense of humor. So just a quick excerpt from this says, "Here are the ration books. I think it's all we had. The larger pair, books 1 and 2, Marion remembers as for meat and sugar. 1945 and 46 wine ration books. 1945 beer book. Can't remember what 1 unit was. I'm wrong. There was a very important one missing from this group, the liquor book. That's all in caps. 1 or 2 bottles per person per month, and you took what they had, not always what you wanted if you wanted to drink. So something about this gives me a little bit of hope, I think, for how we're going to look back at this time during the pandemic. Of it was a tough time, everything was really difficult, but I think once we have a little bit of time for retrospect, we might be able to see a bit of the humor in it as well. Now, all of that rationing was done in the service of making sure that the front were able to eat adequately. So here in Guelph, at the Ontario Agricultural College, women were taught during both World Wars, and especially during World War II, how to create nutritious food to be eaten both here and to be sent overseas and to be cooked overseas by the soldiers. And the OAC actually had a test kitchen to perfect the balance of taste and nutrition for recipes that would be served on the front. So as I mentioned, there was this real focus on trying to learn everything we could about nutrition, especially as it was considered essentially a matter of life and death during the war. So this here is a collection of photos that I absolutely love. These are photos of a mobile kitchen that was sent by the citizens of Guelph and Wellington County to England. And it was used by a group of people in the Home Guard. And we actually have a letter from an English lieutenant who was the one who received this. So he wrote, "To the Mayor of Guelph and Wellington County, thanking Guelph for sending this truck over," and he explained that the Home Guard was on civilian rations rather than army rations, which made food harder to come by. So this really made sure that those who were doing the work on the home front were well fed. And you can see everyone's grinning faces in the picture as they eat. That was from World War II. We also have this fantastic letter home from the front from 1918, so during World War I. It's this really chatty letter. You can see it's 8 pages long. It's written from a soldier to his younger brother who was too young to fight. And when I read this letter, it's really clear that he's trying to reassure his family that things are okay with him. He does talk a little bit about how difficult it is on the front, but for the most part, he's trying to kind of make things seem not too bad. He's really trying to reassure everyone. And I found it really interesting because one of the main ways that he does that is by talking about the food. So he writes, "Our rations have been very good recently, and we have received a number of boxes. For breakfast, we have been getting porridge, bacon, bread. For dinner, steaks and new potatoes. For supper, rice and pork or beans, jam and bread. We get tea and margarine for all 3 meals, so what more could we want?" And then he goes on to talk about some of the special treats they get as well. And he finishes with a postscript to his mom, thanking her for the shirt and the treats that she sent, and asking for some toothpaste. So I really like the way that he talks about food as kind of stabilizing force of this one constant of everything might be terrible, but we have this good food. And I also will note he did survive the war and went on to have a truly long and seemingly happy life. Finally, this one's not actually eaten during a war, but it is a program from a World War I anniversary dinner held in the 1930s. Each of the dishes on it is inspired by a place or a battle from the war. So you've got Russian salad, French potato salad, Passchendaele pickles, etc. And I really like this one too, because it's, again, this way of looking at using food to connect to the past, but a little bit in a slightly more lighthearted way. So I can imagine 10, 20, 30 years from now, if someone were to have a 2020s party, I'm sure sourdough would be served. We'd have quarantinis being served. There's going to be a way to look back and kind of enjoy. Now, one other thing that I came across while looking at the World War II records was actually in a different folder in the same box. So we have these 2 nuclear fallout shelter guides, which were distributed by the Wellington County and City of Guelph Emergency Measures Organization in 1961, so during the Cold War. And they have instructions for how to survive nuclear fallout, which is pretty dramatic. But I found it particularly interesting that, just like now, the instructions were to have enough supplies to survive in isolation for 14 days. So this is something we could maybe haul out and look at again. It's got instructions for how much food you should have for each kind of age of person and how many people you have in your family. Now, that was kind of food in times of hardship. The majority of the cooking related materials that we have in the collection are reflective simply of everyday eating experiences. And this kind of gives us this sense that life goes on, life was life no matter the era, everyone had to eat. We've got these two great pictures from 1907. This shows W.H. Fielding, which is a grocery store, and it's actually where Park Grocery is right now. And also the Candy Kitchen, which is the most opulent looking candy store I've ever seen. So that's a little snapshot of the food world of Guelph in 1907. We have 3 ovens I'm going to show you that were created by the Guelph Stove Company. I'm going to do a quick walk through each of these and show how the technology changed. There's actually in a book that we have from 1907, there's an advertisement for the souvenir stoves and ranges, and this ad calls them the most up-to-date devices for saving labor and annoying little things so detestable to housewives. So we can take a look at these and see just how much labor went into using these. So this one is actually a style of oven that I've used before. It's wood-fired, so you have to build a fire. The picture in the lower right there shows the 4 elements, and depending on how close you are to that fire and how you've stoked that fire will affect how hot your oven is. And then over on the right-hand side, there would be a water boiler. So this was a lot of work to really maintain the temperature and to try and get a sense of consistency. The next one here, this one is the Scout stove. This particular oven was actually used from the 1940s to 1970s in a cottage in Muskoka. It's also a wood-fired one, but I really like this one because it has a heat indicator on it. And often when we look at old recipes, there are instructions to cook something in a slow oven or to cook something in a hot oven, and it feels really vague to us now. So this one actually gives you number values for those, which is very helpful. And then finally, we have the Acme stove. This one was made between 1920 and 1940, and this one is a gas stove. So that would have been a huge time saver, would have made life much easier, much less detestable for those poor old housewives. So I am going to talk next about that recipe box that I mentioned earlier that had the war bread recipe in it. So we have this beautiful box here. We don't have the recipes in it right now. We've taken them out to preserve them, but the recipes themselves look like this. So it's a whole selection of handwritten newspaper clippings, and then also some pre-printed ones that look like they probably came with the box. So it's this huge collection of recipes that were gathered over a period of time. We don't have an exact date on when these are from. We do have a name associated with it. This belonged to Agnes McTagg. There was an Agnes McTagg Senior and an Agnes McTagg Junior, so we're not quite sure, but it looked like these ones were likely from the 20s through the 60s, roughly. And this collection, because it spans such a long period of time, can tell us so much about the owner of a lot of these recipes. So I'm going to go back and show you some of the pictures that came from those. These up here. So one thing that we can read out of this recipe collection is a little bit about the interests of the owner of these recipes. So we have things like a pamphlet with bridge party food suggestions titled How to Make Your Bridge Party a Grand Slam. So that tells us something a little bit about her social life, potentially, something she was at least interested in doing. And then over on the side, there's kind of some more novelty recipes, maybe. So the top one there has 2 recipes for Mexican food. Neither of these recipes contain anything that I think anyone would recognize as Mexican right now. One has a mix of tomato, onion, green pepper, salt, pepper, vinegar, and paprika spread on slices of bologna and mustard if so desired. And the other one is sort of like a baked French toast dish with a lot of the same ingredients. So you can see there's a little bit of adventurousness, a little bit of trying to reach a little bit further past Guelph maybe to see what else was out there. And then the bottom recipe, the bottom picture there has a recipe for toy sandwiches, which were also cut out from a newspaper. And this was something I had never heard of before. I had never heard of toy, but it was one of those things where a really quick Google search can actually reveal quite a lot. So toy was a mining town in Ohio, which had just recently gained notoriety for becoming a ghost town in the late 1920s. And the instructions for these sandwiches say to stack them like a log cabin. So there's kind of this idea of maybe like a themed lunch that you're trying to throw. So there's a certain playfulness with the food there. We learn a little bit about some health and wellness concerns in the family. So there's a recipe for bran and date bread with the note, acts as a mild laxative during warm weather. And there's also a cutout recipe for complexion salad with a note saying that it's good for the entire family. And this recipe includes gelatin, water, vinegar, lemon juice, onion juice, sugar, salt, grated carrots, grated cabbage, and chopped parsley or raw spinach. You set it all, and then you garnish it with mayonnaise dressing. So I don't know what good for the entire family means there. I'm not sure everyone would have been super keen on that, but it's something that was collected by the owner of this collection. We don't know if she used it or not, but it was clearly of interest. Another thing that's really common in these recipes and in many handwritten and older recipe books is some variation on the phrase "in the usual way," or just having a list of ingredients with no method, maybe not even a full list of the ingredients. This is actually going to come up again at the end of the presentation as we see some of our staff try and grapple with making these recipes that were maybe not fully complete, but it really does point to the fact that a lot of making these would be expected to either have kind of intergenerational knowledge of these techniques or would just be so experienced that they would know how to fill in the gaps. Something else I found really interesting in this collection were some of the pre-printed cards. They tell us a lot about food consumption and food purchasing habits at the time. So in helpful hints on making sandwiches, they suggest that for dainty sandwiches for entertaining, the crust is trimmed. But you're not just trimming the crust, you then have to, of course, keep those crusts and turn them into breadcrumbs or use them in bread pudding. So there's a sense of course, you would never let anything go to waste. Similarly, in helpful hints on the cooking of meats, they say that meat should be unwrapped as soon as it comes from the market and placed in a dry, uncovered dish. So that tells us it's a very different grocery shopping experience to what we would have now. And for this as well, they recommend saving all trimmings to be used in making soup stock. Now, a lot of these recipes really do feel quite outlandish. There is a heavy reliance on mayonnaise and marshmallows, often in combination. You can see, I don't know how clearly you can see this recipe here, but it's got sugar, flour, eggs, and vinegar, along with all sorts of tropical fruits, all kind of smashed in together. So it seems a little jarring to us now, but at the same time, I kind of can't help admiring the adventurous spirit of a lot of these recipes. There's all sorts of flavor and texture combinations that we would never actually try now. It's easy to think of food in the past as all being kind of gray and bland, but some of these are the farthest thing from that. So as I said, we'll be trying some at the end, and you see just how unusual they are to a contemporary palate. Now we also have this book. This one's a bit different. It's the farthest thing from a handwritten collection. It's a book that was published in the United States in 1915, and it's all about anxieties around food adulteration. So I think we often of worrying about preservatives in food is a fairly modern concern, but this actually comes from over 100 years ago, right around when the Food and Drug Administration in the United States was being founded, because there were huge problems with food adulteration, with all sorts of really horrifying chemicals being added to everyday foods. So this book was produced by a chemist in the United States who explains a little bit about the various nutritional values of different foods, and then simply goes on to list all of the various brands that are considered safe to consume and non-adulterated. I think this one's a really interesting piece in our collection because it is from this American context, but clearly someone in Guelph in 1915 was experiencing these same concerns. This tells us a little bit about how people were thinking about food at the time. So someone purchased this book to really be able to navigate this food world. We have this book called The Mistress of All Work. This one is more of a a general guide to domestic work, so it's not just cooking. But I found this one absolutely fascinating. So this one is from 1916. It's about how to run a domestic domain. It's very clearly addressed to women. And the introduction, it's got like a 3-chapter introduction, which is essentially just this huge rant about how women these days don't want to be in the kitchen. They don't want to be working in the home. They all think they have better things to do. It's a very angry read, I would say, and it's really trying to insist to the reader of this book that the best place to be is in the home. Of course, it's from 1916, so World War I was underway, so women's roles were changing here in Canada. And of course, the suffrage movement was hugely underway at the time. So it's a really interesting illustration of some anxieties that were being experienced, clearly. So that itself is interesting. But then the physical book itself has one more clue that I absolutely love about the experience of reading something like this. So when we look at the book here, it's just a small book. And when you go to open it to the introduction, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but often books that come from the printer, they won't have all of their pages cut. So they'll still have some pages that are attached to each other. So here we have page 8, 9, and then it jumps to 12, 13. And there's these 2 pages that are fused together. And likewise with the next pair of pages. And that's right in the middle of that introduction about women's role in the world versus in the home. And so I kind of can't help wondering, I have a pet theory about this, that as far as we know, this was owned by someone, by a woman in 1916. But I can't help wondering if a mother, a grandmother, maybe even a new mother-in-law gave this to her as a bit of a hint. And clearly this woman owned it, but she wasn't reading it so closely that she would have actually cut the pages open to actually read it, which was what you would do quite easily if you wanted to read those pages. So I really can't help wondering what that particular woman's attitude to suffrage and to women's role in the home versus in the workforce was like. The next book we're going to look at is also too fragile to open, but I want to show it to you just because it's such a beautiful object in its own right. This is a handwritten cookbook. From what we can tell of the dates in here, the recipes were collected in the 20s and 30s, possibly a little more on either side. And it's all just chock full of handwritten and cut out recipes. And you can see here, there's even a recipe that's just, it's got a nail just attaching it to the cover. So it's a very kind of informally collected book. I'm going to go back to that slideshow so we can really look at some of the pieces from that. So yes, this is the handwritten cookbook here. Here's a little bit of what it looks like inside. And this book really reflects how much cookbooks functioned as general domestic and work guidebooks. So it shows how there wasn't necessarily cooking as an alienated thing that you would do, but working in the home was a whole integrated set of tasks, skills, of real expertise. So this book has not just recipes, but right in with all of the recipes, it has recipes for various wines and homebrew. It has cold remedies, and it has cures and instructions for various farm animal ailments. So it's this real domestic guide of all of the work that someone, almost certainly a woman, would have been doing around the house, all the skills that she really would have had and collected. And really interestingly, kind of serendipitously, folded into this book, there is this lesson page here. So this is from March 1924, and it's a lesson on communicable diseases and how they're spread. And it was just such an interesting thing to read. It has terminology that I didn't know before this year. It talks about fomites and things spreading through touching surfaces. So that was a kind of wonderful moment of connection with history, I found. The next book we're talking about is called Canada's Favorite Cookbook, a bold claim from the year 1907. This is a huge tome of a book. In its introduction, it announces that it is embellished with many colored and photo engravings illustrating the art of carving, table decoration, preparation of fancy dishes, etc. We're going to talk about those fancy dishes a little bit later, but there's a couple things I wanted to point out with this now. There's a whole little section on vegetarianism, this new concept of vegetarianism. It's in their section on Thanksgiving, and it gives instructions for how to substitute out certain things. It has a very early protein substitute, which sounds absolutely horrific, but the thought is there. It's quite nice. Listing the meanings of foreign words used on menu cards. And a lot of these are really amusing to read now. So caramel is defined as burnt sugar. Curry is an East Indian condiment. Macaroni is a paste made from flour. Mayonnaise is a salad dressing. Puree is ingredients rubbed through a sieve, tells us a little bit about the actual techniques used. Roquefort is imported cheese. The other cheeses in here are no more descriptive, really. Camembert is a kind of cheese. Neufchâtel is a soft kind of Swiss cheese. And Parmesan is a kind of Italian cheese. And then finally, spaghetti is defined as similar to macaroni. So we're getting there. We're getting a little bit of information there, but not a huge amount. Finally, I want to talk about celebration food. So this is one of the absolute highlights of looking at the place of food in history and society. There's the fact that it's at the center of virtually every celebration. For example, look at the fact this year that around Thanksgiving, there was a run on turkeys. So even if we weren't all able to gather in person to do a normal Thanksgiving celebration, if that's something you do, the one thing people could recreate, even in their smaller family groups, was the same food as ever. So that gives us this sense of constancy, of stability. It's certainly a bit poignant this year to think about people coming together to eat, as we're about to do, but it's also a bit of a nice reminder that life goes on, and soon, in this season, when there's so many groups trying to come together to eat, we'll be able to do this again soon. So the first one I'm going to show you here is from the Made in Canada Fair and Poster Show. So this was from 1907. And it gives an introduction to the city of Guelph. So this is the program for this show. This show was all about showcasing the manufacturers of Guelph, of showing what a vibrant city we were in 1907. It's really interesting, actually. The introduction shows us a little bit about the values of those who were writing it. So it says about Guelph: its people as a whole well-to-do. A few places can boast of a population enjoying equal distribution of wealth to a larger degree. Labor in nearly all branches is unionized, and the earnings of artisans enable them to buy freely and live in comfort. So it sounds absolutely wonderful. There's all sorts of different food stalls, and we have this fantastic picture of the ladies of one of the ice cream stalls. So there was 2 different ice cream stalls there, and these women are dressed quite snappily and ready to serve up some delicious ice cream. We also have these train menus, which I absolutely adore. So these are from 1927. They are souvenir train menus from a trip taken across Canada by train. And I really love these because these illustrate how good food can be for giving us that sensory connection to the past. So when you read about these elaborate meals that were being served on your white linen table in your train as the countryside of Canada passes by, it really brings this whole imagined sensory experience to life for me. Similarly, we have the Christmas menu from the Priory Hotel from Christmas of 1908. So that was a hotel here in Guelph, here in downtown Guelph. And it's, again, just fun to think of right around this time, about 112 years ago, to eat here in Guelph. Most of the food in this is actually fairly recognizable as something you might want to eat at a celebration today, although it does have as its savory entrees quite a strange assortment of things under the entrees. So you can have a compote of rice with peaches, you can have macaroni and cheese, or you can have a cherry omelet. So I have some questions about that last one, but on the whole, it sounds like a good time. Going back to Canada's favorite cookbook, it gives elaborate instructions for dinner giving, so for how to throw a good party, basically. The instructions are all about making sure that you seat compatible people next to each other. You want to make a really lovely convivial time. Although my favorite part of this is at the very end of this introduction. It is generally understood that all present are desirable persons, and yet an acquaintanceship begun under such auspices need not extend beyond the occasion that gave it birth, unless so desired, which is a lovely invitation to not actually have to continue socializing with people afterwards. There's a whole bunch of different special events that they give recommended menus for, along with kind of Pinterest perfect decorating suggestions. So for the King's birthday, for example, they recommend decorating the name cards at the dinner with the seal of Great Britain in the upper left-hand corner, or sketch thereon the King's picture and pen an appropriate couplet underneath. So just a casual artistic creation there. For Valentine's Day, among other things, they suggest serving orangeade as a cooling drink for lovers young and old. On Easter Sunday, they say, on this special day for breakfast, let the eggs be cooked to order as best pleases each individual fancy. This privilege will be greatly appreciated, especially by the little folks who like innovations. And for Halloween, they recommend throwing a party so that all of the neighborhood boys will have something to distract them rather than going out and pulling pranks on their neighbors. So it gives us a little bit of a sense of how these various things were being celebrated. And then finally, the last recipe I'm going to talk about in terms of this before we start getting into the ones that we made ourselves, of course, comes from that recipe box that I love. And this one is really, really poignant. It was a folded up piece of newspaper or of magazine. On the one side, it has a photo illustrated set of kind of reporting on the Russian forces driving away the German army at the end of World War II. And then on the main side that we're looking at, it has a recipe for victory chocolate cake. So this is a cake that was suggested that you bake at the end of the war to celebrate. It is sugar-free because rationing obviously was still underway. So this is literally a bittersweet cake. It's a celebration for the end of a very hard time where you're experiencing all of these things. And we're seeing the vaccine for COVID roll out right now. People are calling it V-Day when the first ones are being done in each country. So I'd like to think that we can really understand what it must have been like to eat a cake like that, to have that terrible, terrible time coming to an end and wanting to celebrate, but also having a whole lot to mourn. But hopefully we'll all be able to celebrate soon. So without further ado, we are going to jump into the Great Guelph Museum's cooking show. So this is, I enlisted a whole bunch of the Guelph Museum's staff to help make some of these older recipes. And through making them and eating them, we can actually learn a little bit more about the experiences of those who would have made them. So first up, we have a recipe for gingerbread. This one comes from that handwritten cookbook from the 20s and 30s. It's handwritten. It's the owner's own jot notes to herself about how to make gingerbread. So there is no method given. There is no amount of flour given. So Ken, our education coordinator, tried making this and had pretty reasonable results. It took a little bit of experimentation, but it worked pretty well. And in fact, he had actually recently made his great-grandmother's gingerbread recipe. So like I was saying, with a lot of these recipes that don't have the full recipe, you would have relied on that inherited knowledge, you would have relied on your own experience. So Ken was able to substitute this old recipe that he had used before to kind of help him fill in the blanks. Similarly, we have a recipe for caraway seed cookies. This, again, it was a mostly complete recipe. The amount of flour given was just flour to roll. So there was a little bit of experimentation done here. Laura, our collections assistant, made these, and her father very bravely tried them. And I am told that despite his expression here, the cookies did grow on him eventually. And for her, she was able to look up some instructions online. So that's another similar kind of collective knowledge base that we have now that we can substitute out for that knowledge that we would have had. Next up, there is a recipe for marshmallows. And I tried my hand at this one. I have a neighbor from back home where I was growing up who used to make the most beautiful, fluffy white marshmallows. She would give them to us at Christmas. I had grand visions of these turning out beautifully. I was really excited. And they came out like this. It looks basically like a taffy. It was absolutely horrific, did not taste good, was not the right texture. I was really disappointed at first. But in some ways, it was actually another way of experiencing something that people, and especially women in the past, might have experienced. There's a wonderful chapter in the book Little Women, where Meg, who her true vocation is to be a homemaker, to really do all of the domestic things. She loves doing that. She has a whole, and so there's a chapter where she has a whole day set out to make jam. It's going to be her great jam making day. She's going to be all set up. And for whatever reason, her jam just won't gel. And she is distraught. And it's this whole chapter in this book about how devastating it is for this seemingly kind of innocuous thing to happen. Her husband is absolutely baffled by why she's so upset. But there was a lot of pressure to pull off a lot of these recipes really well. There was a lot of pressure to kind of show what you could do. So that sense of slightly crushing disappointment actually allowed me to feel what countless generations of homemakers and cooks have felt. So I'm trying to spin this into a positive experience for myself. Next up, we have the supper dish. So this is a recipe that was contributed to a community cookbook published by the Ladies' Aid of Norfolk Street United Church around the year 1930. And we had a couple people try this one out. It came out looking like this. So Paula, our customer service assistant, did a great job really trying to be as authentic as possible. So using a slightly fattier milk, she used thick cut bread. And both she and Dawn, our curator, and her family found it a little bit bland, a little bit mushy. It wasn't particularly inspiring. But what I really like about this is that it is from a community cookbook created and contributed to by women in the community. And this was a really simple dish to pull together. Everyone who made this said it was really easy to pull together. So it was just kind of like a simple weeknight meal. You can kind of get a sense of women helping women out. I should also note, though, in that community cookbook, the vast majority of the recipes are for baked goods and other sweet things. So I think that will always stay the same in the recipes we really like sharing with each other. Next, we have the crisp rolled oat macaroons, and this recipe comes from that pamphlet on war bread. So this was a recipe using substitutes, using things that maybe were not quite as luxuriant as people might have liked to use in baked goods. And so Val Harrison made this, our visitor experiences supervisor, and so did Dawn. And they all had varying thoughts on it. So Dawn served this to her 10-year-old daughter, who said that it tasted like what would happen if a granola bar factory malfunctioned. So not exactly a glowing review. And Val's 93-year-old mother-in-law, Thelma, said that this is exactly the kind of thing that she can remember her mother making during the war. So we got points for authenticity there. Everyone who tried these, myself included, found them desperately bland. They were pretty grim. We all agree that even some raisins, a bit of honey, certainly drizzling them with chocolate would have livened them up. But it was certainly an interesting illustration of the tough times, the tough eating times during World War II. Now, the next three are all from that recipe box, and they are from the pre-printed cards given in the box. We don't have any evidence that this is something that the owner of the recipe box used. There's no stains on them or anything, as there are on a lot of these. And they're obviously not things that she cut out specifically. They came with the collection. So it's possible that these are not things that she would have actually realistically made. They might be more of what a recipe box creator would think would be kind of the trendy thing to put in, what should be in this. So yeah, we don't know if these were actually eaten by the owner of this, but we figured they were worth a try just because they were so ridiculous. They were not great. There's going to be 3 recipes I'm going to show you. I think the best thing that can be said about them is if you have family members who are still insisting that huge family gatherings are a good time this time of year, threaten to bring one of these and you will very quickly be uninvited. They're very handy for that. So the first one, and you might have been reading the recipe here while I talk, is a banana and nut salad. So you've got your banana and you put your crushed peanuts on it and you drizzle the whole thing with French dressing. This one was okay. I enlisted my partner to help me eat these, and we managed to get through it. The banana and peanut combo, no problem. The French dressing was sweet, so it kind of went, but it was not fantastic. The next one is a pear-pimento cheese salad. Again, very loose definitions of the word salad here. This one was the most horrifying of the bunch. So you stick a whole bunch of pimento cheese through a strainer over a chilled pear, and then drizzle that with French dressing too. And that was a strange, sweet, salty, watery combination that I would not recommend. And then finally, we had the pineapple and marshmallow salad with pimento cheese balls. Oddly, this one was not quite as terrible. I only had the colorful marshmallows, but that felt particularly apt for the kind of Technicolor vibe we had going here. So this one is pineapples and marshmallows that you have then drizzled mayonnaise dressing over top of, and then you put 3 balls of pimento cheese around it and you eat the whole thing together. And yeah, surprisingly, we were able to finish that one. So would not eat more, would not go back for seconds, but it was not the worst thing I have ever eaten. I'll say that for it. That honor goes to this. So this is the very final one that we're going to be showing. This is the Effervescent Egg Drink. Now this one was not just part of this collection already. This is something that the owner of the recipe box cut out of the paper. We don't know if she ever tried it, but certainly she was interested in it enough to kind of collect it. And this, so you make a glass of lemonade, and you add a tablespoon of beaten egg, and then some grape juice, and then you shake it all up with some baking soda until it fizzes. And this was so, so horrifying that I had to dare the staff of Guelph Museums to try making it and drinking it. So we have a short video compilation of what that looked like. Here, I'm just going to share this with you. 1 second. This is frothy. Somewhere down here there's some liquid. It's mostly just fizz right now.
Oh, I'm so scared for you.
The fizz itself is quite nice. We'll see if I can get down to the liquid. It's got a thickness to it that I don't love. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I do a taste?
Yes, taste it.
Effervescent egg drink.
Yeah.
It's not very effervescent.
Alright, that's good on my part.
Hold on.
Ooh. All right, so a huge thank you to Serena, Dawn, and Anna for attempting that along with me. It was very brave. So that brings us pretty much to the end of the presentation. We definitely want to encourage you to try making some of these recipes. So we will be posting those online. They're going to be in the comments section of this Facebook video. We'll also have them on our website, and we'll have links to that throughout our social media. We would absolutely love to see anything that you might make. So if you make any of these recipes, take a picture, tag us in it for sure, and we'll definitely feature that. We'd love to see it. And if there's any other recipes in here that I mentioned that you're interested in that we don't post on, definitely feel free to reach out to us, and we'll try and get those to you and any other information about them. So thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to come back next month on January 20th for our next History Bites session, which will be about our exhibit, Guelph circa 1999. And that's everything. Have a great day, everyone.